Welcome to HagueTalks, the podcast, where we hear directly from some of the HagueTalks community about how they're setting peace and justice in motion.
My name is Revai Aalbaek, and my job title is Senior Advisor for Security and Justice for UNDP Crisis Bureau and implementing the global program on rule of law.
I'm Janet Anderson. I caught up with Revai Aalbaek at the Hague Justice Week 2023 and started off by asking her to tell me a bit more about the reality of her amazing job title, Senior Advisor for Security and Justice for the United Nations Development Programme Crisis Bureau. What does that mean?
So basically what that means is that the work itself literally is about us engaging with, for example, justice institutions. We are working with civil society and working with communities, supporting, number one, their aspirations of what justice is and what kind of justice systems and mechanisms they want to see in place. But we are also working significantly with state institutions, the police, prosecution. We're working with the courts. We are working with the judiciaries to support and strengthen their own capacities for justice delivery. And in particular, within the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of work started being done around e-governance and e-justice. So a lot of rolling out of case management systems, virtual courts, because all of a sudden we realized we could not administer or deliver justice globally because of the limited capacities to travel and to interact on a physical basis. So that also gave rise to new innovations around capitalizing on digital platforms. We are also working on gender justice. And as UNDP, we are cooperating with UN Women, and we have come together to create this innovative platform called the Gender Justice Platform. And the event that we did this week at the Hague Justice Week was just but part of the initiatives that we are doing on gender justice, working with women in the judiciary, but more particularly bringing a spotlight to the issue of leadership of women in the judiciary, the kind of challenges that they are facing, and the kind of support that they need to bring forth their leadership in those very complex, difficult, and patriarchal spaces, but also trying to find also mechanisms of inspiring more women to be in those kind of places of leadership. We're also working on transitional justice, which is a very, very complex issue. So in that regard, quite a bit of our work also is in conflict crisis and transitional settings globally. We are working in Central African Republic, for example. We are working in Colombia. We are working in Somalia. We are working in Yemen. And all these kind of contexts, which are, number one, very difficult because of the conflicts that are ongoing. So that is very, very difficult, I think, initially, because to even talk about rule of law and justice, because we were like, stop the conflict first. But we know that peace, rule of law, development, all of these concepts feed into each other.
Let me pick up on the gender aspect. Courts are and court systems and judicial systems have traditionally been dominated by men. What is it that you can do to try to change the way that these systems operate, to give the space for women to feel confident and to take the leadership roles?
I think it's a very important question, but it's also a complex question, because I think we need to situate the judicial institutions within the broader context of society and within the definitions of some of the stereotypes, gender stereotypes of what women can or cannot necessarily do. So in this regard, for me, I see the steps and processes starting from the very beginning, encouraging young women, girls, to take up studies in law. And I know over the years, at least if I were to speak for my country, Zimbabwe, and if I were also to speak for some of the other countries in the global south, there's been a lot of uptake of young women, girls entering law schools at universities. It is also about facilitating and giving them that space while they're still at law school to understand and appreciate not just the raw, dry, legal processes and what the law is about, but to expand their horizons. Studies on gender, critical and important. And in many ways, I do believe if they could also even be made compulsory, I think that would also mean that all the products coming out of these law schools are much more sensitive and attuned to the gender challenges and the inequalities, exclusion that we experience in this world, so that ultimately, in whatever space that they will occupy in the legal field, they are aware and they will know how to address some of these issues and how to apply the law in a sensitive manner. Moving forward now to the institutions themselves, I think there are many challenges, of course, at entry point. Oftentimes, it is, and again, we are trying to change an institution that is highly patriarchal. We know the law by itself, right? It's also highly, it's a male construct. And to deconstruct all of that, it is a structural issue that is also complex to address. So, first of all, one thing that we've noticed, both in civil and some common law systems, processes of appointment of magistrates or of judges differ. Some of them are enabling. They are giving the space for women to enter and sit on the bench. But for some of them, even though there may be, let's say, interviews are done, sometimes they're even public interviews, but there are all sorts of processes potentially behind the scenes that happen, of lobby, of negotiation, and ultimately when the decisions are made by any judicial service commission, for example, it is the final decision, and it's often very difficult to challenge why one particular candidate was preferred over another. But I think one of the key aspects or issues potentially that could make this whole process a bit more transparent and a bit clearer for candidates is to go the way that quotas or special temporary measures you've been introduced, for example, for women in politics or women in management positions in administration, broadly speaking. I know this is not something that has really been applied when it comes to occupying positions on the bench. And I potentially know the reason why, because I think the point will be, if we start using quotas for the judiciary, people start questioning, are you getting the lawyers who are fully qualified to be on the bench? Are they astute enough? Will they write good judgments? Will they make good judgments? So a lot of questions will start being put, around the quality of the women that will sit on the bench.
But if you don't lay some kind of benchmarks, if you don't say this what should happen, then how do you ever get change?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is the question. And yet at the same time, we also do know that I think some of the quality questions that get to be asked are not necessarily asked of our, male colleagues or counterparts, because we also know, based on judgments, based on a lot of stuff that is in the public that is not necessarily of good quality either. But I think for that reason, I know because, again, we hold the judiciary in high esteem in all countries. And I think ultimately because they are the ultimate arbiter, right? Whether we are having political crises, whether we are having social issues that really require huge determination of what the law should be or the law should say. So for that reason, I do respect, I think, the theoretical underpinnings of why it has to be that. But yet at the same time, I think in this globally changing world, where we are very clear that when we talk about inclusion and when we're talking about marginalization, it's not just theoretical, it's for real. And we know about representation and how it matters to be represented. Because the moment you are not on the table and the moment you are not on that seat, it means also your issues are likely to fall off the table or never to be on the table at all. So it is a journey. It is a complex one. But I must say to the fact that over the years, at least for me, having worked mostly in the global south, there has been a number of strides that have been made. Women lawyers associations, for example, have been huge advocates for increasing the number of women judges on the bench. They've been huge advocates of supporting the women judges associations, for example. They have really done a lot through resource mobilization to support and train, put train in quotation marks, because I know that lawyers feel like, they are learned, but at the same time, there's also opportunities to train and build their capacity so that they can rise through the ranks, of judicial systems and judicial processes and ultimately occupy those very important coveted seats on the bench.
So grassroots upwards, or support the women judges already in place to go further? Which are the best approaches?
To be honest with you, I would say both, because I think over the generations and over a period of time, we need both to converge, because from grassroots up, I mean, it will take much longer, for sure. For a young girl entering high school and deciding, I will eventually want to study law, it will take another 5-10 years, for her to be ultimately sitting there. While ultimately for that woman judge or woman magistrate who is sitting there, there is really an opportune moment for those who have that ambition and those who really want to sit there to then keep supporting them and pushing them and giving them those opportunities. And I really think the issue of exposure is also really, really critical. Oftentimes, the women are sitting on the bench in their own country context. The processes, for example, happening during the Hague Week, this week, what I've managed to witness would be fantastic, opportunities to expose the women magistrates, the women judges, so that they're able to engage in an international space and see what is possible, what is potentially not possible, and what are some of the challenges that they have to overcome, and listen and hear, and then path their way in terms of the career path and the career growth that they want to pursue.
Now Revai works in the UNDP Pacific office in Fiji, and I wondered about her journey growing up in Zimbabwe and starting off her career and how her upbringing shaped her. What kind of a little girl were you that ended up doing the kind of work that you are doing now?
Oh my goodness me. I don't know whether I can really, I'll try to recall in the sense that I grew up in Zimbabwe, born and grew up in Zimbabwe. And I think in many ways it was a privilege, because of the setup of our country and our communities. You have what you call your rural home, where all your relatives are and, you interact and work together and live together. So it's like one big happy family, one could say. But at the same time, I also had the opportunity to be in the city, where my father was working. He was in the police force and we could also go to the city. So I had my first years of education in a rural school, which at the time I think was really, really good, because it was immediately after Zimbabwe's independence in 1980, and we had quite good quality education. But as I was growing up in that very vibrant, I would say, rural environment, I also was quite aware, I'm not sure how this ever arose, but quite attuned to some of the gender stereotypes. I didn't have that word in my head back then, but only now I can say so. In terms of how, division of labor in the home between boys and girls, but also the messaging that was being given to girls and being given to boys. I could see the difference. So I'll give you an example of how there were always this messaging. As a girl, you should learn how to cook. And also when you learn how to cook, it's not just about learn how to cook. Learn how to cook potentially even a big meal, because you never know where you get married. Maybe there are so many people in that village, you have to cook a lot, or in that family, you have to cook a big meal. I really despised that message, because I really was, why do I have to do this? I remember one of my relatives used to say, I think, Revai, is because you are lazy. That's why you don't want to do it. I said, no, it's not about that. But I think in a very unintentionally, I think I actually rebelled against that message. I say so because for the longest time, I actually didn't cook. I just didn't. I just couldn't. And I remember even after finishing university, and I was sharing an apartment with one of my friends, she would do all the cooking and I would do all the cleaning. Only much later in my life did I eventually start cooking, and only because I wanted to. So for that reason, and I mean, it may look like a small, silly example, but I think it's embedded. It was embedded in me in terms of challenging, some of these gender stereotypes and messages that we received, or at least I definitely received, and I noticed them when I was growing up.
And have you had to battle against those stereotypes, either gender or maybe to do with your background coming from the global south as you've carried on your career? Do you find that that's something that you have to bear in mind?
Honestly, I think to some extent, absolutely yes. And at the same time, I also want to say I was very privileged, I would say, in many ways, that when I chosen the career path that I did choose, I also had very strong mentors, very strong women around me. Starting off with one of my professors at university who took me through gender studies, and I caught on to that immediately. I think it resonated with me. And the fact that immediately after I finished university, I worked for a women lawyers organization where I was providing legal aid for women. So all of that then became so real, in my own, professional life, but also to some extent personal life, because as I was going through the work on a daily basis, listening to these harrowing, heart-wrenching stories of women, going through divorces, being disinherited as widows, gender and sexual-based violence, having at some point representing a young girl, aged 8, who was raped, infected with HIV. She died before the trial even concluded. All of that put together, for me, in some ways, I think, sent the message, you have to be strong. This world is not for women. You really have to be strong. And for that reason, I think as I continued to grow in my career with the strong group of friends around me and the strong group of mentors around me, I think to some extent I managed to create, I think, a certain, wall, but also to be equipped with tools of being able to see the stereotypes if they were being applied on me personally, but also how to deal with those stereotypes when they're being applied on me personally. So for that reason, I think I have managed to navigate, and I'm also truly grateful, and I feel really privileged as well, having grown up in the Global South, to be in this very important position and to work also within this very important institution, which UNDP is, where I also have very supportive, colleagues. And again, for now, I must say, I never think about it at all.
As the UNDP is opening a new office in The Hague, I also asked Revai what The Hague can bring to the mission of the UNDP, which has a much broader focus than justice and accountability.
So UNDP is establishing its presence in The Hague. And one of the key aspects of work that we'll be working with is what we call the Justice Futures CoLab. And CoLab is Collaborative Laboratory. One of the key things that we noticed, and I think everybody is quite aware, based on our experiences during COVID-19, there are certain retrogressions that happened within broadly the rule of law, justice, human rights world, right? And the sense of injustice, in particular, compounded by the multiple crises that the globe is facing, that the world is facing, basically is requiring us to think much broader and outside of the box, to think much more connectedness and less working in silos. So for that reason, the Justice Futures CoLab that UNDP's office will be leading from The Hague, it's really about experimentation. It's really about having robust conversations around justice systems, justice processes. How can they be much more responsive to the needs of the people? One of the key aspects I also want to add in this conversation is the fact that also the investment towards justice work globally is dropping. And yet at the same time, the sense of injustice is getting bigger and bigger. So there is a challenge that we are facing at this particular moment. So what does The Hague symbolize for us? Obviously, the historical importance of The Hague as the city for justice is absolutely important for us. I think that is one of the reasons why we are here. But also being connected to all the global actors working on justice who are based in The Hague, it's a critical addition to the work that we are doing, to be connected to those partners, but at the same time also allowing ourselves to unpack what we already know and to be able to experiment, iterate, learn, and keep moving forward and challenging quite a number of assumptions that we've been working with when it comes to this very important work on justice.
Thank you, Revai, for shedding light on your work fighting for gender equality in the justice system. Check out all the podcasts for Hague Talks. This first collection is around Hague Justice Week with some of the great people setting peace and justice in motion. And don't forget to like and share Hague Talks, the podcast.